90-year-old elephant keeper gets one last wish. What the herd does next has the whole world weeping. The sun had barely risen over the horizon when James Walker made his final journey to the elephant sanctuary he had called home for the past 60 years. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he gripped his walking stick, but his eyes sparkled with the same fierce determination that had carried him through decades of caring for the world's largest land mammals. At 90 years old, the doctors had given him just weeks to live, but James had one last wish: to say goodbye to the herd that had become his family. Maria, his favorite nurse from the hospice, helped him out of the car and into his wheelchair. She had tried to convince him to stay in bed today, but James wouldn't hear of it. "These elephants," he had told her, his voice weak but unwavering, "they've been there for every important moment of my life. They need to be there for this one too." As they approached the sanctuary gates, memories flooded back like a tidal wave. James remembered the day he started working here in 1964, fresh-faced and terrified, yet completely captivated by these magnificent creatures. Back then, the sanctuary had been little more than a few acres of land and 3 rescued circus elephants. Now it sprawled across hundreds of acres and was home to over 30 elephants, each with their own story of survival and resilience. The morning mist parted as Maria wheeled him toward the main enclosure. Several of the younger keepers, who James had trained himself, were already waiting. Their eyes were red-rimmed, but they managed warm smiles as they greeted their mentor. Word had spread quickly through the sanctuary about James's condition, and no one had wanted to miss his final visit. "They've been restless all morning," Sarah, his most promising student, told him softly. "It's like they knew you were coming." James nodded, fighting back tears. Elephants were among the most emotionally intelligent creatures on Earth, something he had learned countless times over his career. Of course, they would sense that something was different today. The first elephant to approach was Matriarch Rose, a massive African elephant who had arrived at the sanctuary 30 years ago after being rescued from poachers. She had lost part of her right ear and carried deep emotional scars, but under James's care, she had flourished and become the gentle leader of the herd. Now she moved with deliberate grace toward his wheelchair, her trunk extended in greeting. "Hello, old friend," James whispered, reaching out with trembling fingers to touch her trunk. Rose's deep brown eyes, filled with ancient wisdom, seemed to peer straight into his soul. She let out a soft rumble, a sound James had heard thousands of times before, but never with such profound sadness. Behind Rose, the rest of the herd began to emerge from the morning mist like gray ghosts. There was Raja, the old bull elephant, who had once been so aggressive that other sanctuaries had refused to take him. It had taken James 3 years of patient work to earn his trust, but now Raja was known as the sanctuary's gentle giant. Behind him came Maya and her baby, little James, named in the keeper's honor, followed by the rest of the family group. The younger keepers watched in amazement as the elephants formed a perfect semicircle around James's wheelchair. Even those who had worked at the sanctuary for years had never seen anything quite like it. The air seemed to vibrate with emotion as each elephant reached out to touch James with their trunk, a gesture of recognition and respect that brought tears to everyone's eyes. Maria, who had never worked with elephants before, stood transfixed. In all her years of hospice care, she had never witnessed anything like this. The connection between this elderly man and these massive creatures was almost supernatural in its intensity. As the morning sun climbed higher, James began to speak to them softly, his voice carrying across the sudden stillness of the sanctuary. He told them about his first day, about the countless births and deaths he had witnessed, about the moments of triumph when a rescued elephant finally learned to trust again. His words were meant for the elephants, but they touched everyone present, painting a picture of a life devoted to these extraordinary animals. Rose remained closest to him, her trunk gently resting on his shoulder as if lending him strength. Every few minutes, she would emit a low rumble that the other elephants would answer, creating a symphony of elephant voices that seemed to echo the emotions of the moment. For James, it was like hearing the soundtrack of his life played back to him through the voices of those he loved most. The first part of James's final visit was drawing to a close, but something in the air told everyone present that this was just the beginning of an extraordinary day. As Maria prepared to wheel him to a shaded rest area for a brief break, James reached up one more time to touch Rose's trunk. "I'll be back in a little while, old girl," he promised, his voice thick with emotion. "We've got more to share before the day is done." The herd watched him go, their trunks raised in what almost looked like a salute, and though no one could explain it, there wasn't a dry eye among the keepers as they witnessed this first chapter of James Walker's last wish unfolding before them. Something magical was happening at the sanctuary that day, something that would soon capture the hearts of millions around the world. During his brief rest in the sanctuary's observation pavilion, James's mind wandered back to a moment 30 years ago that had changed everything. The day Rose arrived at the sanctuary. While Maria adjusted his oxygen tank, he shared the story with Sarah and the other keepers gathered around him, his voice growing stronger with each word, as if the memories themselves were giving him renewed energy. "She was nothing but skin and bones back then," James recalled, his eyes distant. "The poachers had killed her entire family. When she arrived, she wouldn't eat, wouldn't move, just stood in the corner of her enclosure staring at nothing. The experts said she probably wouldn't survive the trauma." He paused, a slight smile crossing his weathered face. "But they didn't know Rose like I would come to know her." For 3 months, James had slept in a small cot outside Rose's enclosure, talking to her through the night, reading books aloud, and playing soft classical music. Anything to help her understand that not all humans meant her harm. Then came the morning that changed everything, when he found her reaching through the bars with her trunk, touching his face with a gentleness that brought him to his tears. As James told the story, Sarah noticed something remarkable happening in the main enclosure. The entire herd, led by Rose, had gathered at the closest point to the pavilion, their ears forward, almost as if they were listening to James recount the tale. Every now and then, one of them would emit a low rumble, like a subtle acknowledgement of the shared history being discussed. "What James isn't telling you," Sarah interjected, addressing the small group of visitors who had gathered to witness this extraordinary day, "is that his technique with Rose revolutionized how sanctuaries around the world deal with traumatized elephants. The Walker method has helped save hundreds of elephants who might otherwise have been considered too damaged to rehabilitate." James waved away the praise with embarrassment, but Maria noticed how his eyes lit up when he looked at the waiting herd. "Ready to go back out?" she asked softly. His enthusiastic nod reminded her more of an excited child than a man of 90. As they returned to the enclosure, something unexpected happened. Rose approached, but this time she was carrying something in her trunk, a branch from her favorite acacia tree. The other keepers gasped. Rose was known for zealously guarding her acacia branches, never sharing them with anyone, not even her closest companions in the herd. "Oh, Rose," James whispered, accepting the offering with trembling hands. "You wonderful old girl." The branch was more than just a gift. It was a symbol of everything they had built together, of trust freely given and loyalty earned through years of patient dedication. What happened next left everyone present in awe. Rose gently wrapped her trunk around James's wheelchair and began to guide him toward a specific spot in the enclosure, the same corner where she had stood all those years ago, traumatized and alone. But now, instead of emptiness and despair, the area was filled with life. Several of the younger elephants had gathered there, including little James, who was playfully tossing dust over himself. The significance of the moment wasn't lost on anyone present. Rose was showing James how far they had come together, how the sanctuary had grown from a place of healing into a true home for these magnificent creatures. The corner that had once represented despair now echoed with the sounds of contented elephants living in community. Raja, the once aggressive bull elephant, ambled over and positioned himself protectively behind James's wheelchair, his massive presence like a living wall of support. One by one, other elephants approached, each seeming to want to share a moment with the man who had given them a second chance at life. The younger keepers watched in fascination as the elephants communicated with each other through subtle movements and low-frequency rumbles that humans could barely hear. It was clear that something unprecedented was unfolding, some sort of elephant ceremony that none of them had ever witnessed before. Maria, who had seen many patients near the end of their lives, recognized that she was witnessing something profound. In all her years of hospice care, she had never seen someone so at peace, so completely surrounded by love, even if that love came from beings that most people would never expect to show such complex emotions. As the morning wore on, more visitors gathered at the sanctuary's observation areas, drawn by the unusual behavior of the herd. Nobody wanted to interrupt the powerful scene unfolding before them, but many quietly took photos and videos, sensing that they were witnessing something that needed to be preserved and shared. James sat in his wheelchair, surrounded by his elephant family, occasionally reaching out to touch a trunk here, scratch an ear there, each gesture filled with decades of understanding and affection. His face showed no sign of fatigue. If anything, he seemed to be drawing strength from the presence of these creatures who had been his life's work and his greatest joy. But this remarkable day was far from over. As the sun climbed toward its zenith, the elephants began to move in ways that suggested they had something else to show their beloved keeper, something that would soon have people around the world reaching for their tissues and re-examining everything they thought they knew about the emotional capacity of animals. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sanctuary, something extraordinary began to unfold. Rose, still stationed protectively near James's wheelchair, lifted her trunk and released a series of low, rhythmic rumbles. To everyone's amazement, the other elephants began to respond, creating a harmonious chorus of deep vibrations that seemed to make the very earth pulse with emotion. "I've never heard anything like this," Sarah whispered, her hand clutching her phone as she recorded the unprecedented event. In her 15 years at the sanctuary, she had witnessed countless interactions between the elephants, but this was different. This was deliberate, coordinated, almost like music. James sat up straighter in his wheelchair, his tired eyes suddenly bright with wonder. "They're singing," he said, his voice barely audible above the elephants' symphony. "All these years, and they still managed to surprise me." A tear rolled down his weathered cheek as he recognized snippets of familiar calls woven into the chorus, sounds he had heard over decades of working with these magnificent creatures. The elephant chorus continued for several minutes, drawing more spectators to the observation areas. Even the sanctuary's resident birds fell silent, as if paying respect to this rare moment. Maria, who had been keeping a careful eye on James's vital signs, noticed that his pulse had grown stronger and more steady during the elephant's song, as if their voices were lending him strength. When the chorus finally faded, little James, the baby elephant, broke away from his mother and approached the wheelchair with the playful confidence of youth. He reached out with his small trunk, gently tugging at the pocket of James's jacket, the same pocket where the old keeper had always kept treats during training sessions. James chuckled, his laugh warm despite his weakness. "Sorry, little one. No peppermints today." But the young elephant wasn't deterred. Instead of backing away, he pressed his trunk to James's chest, right above his heart, and held it there. The gesture was so gentle, so deliberate, that several of the visiting families gasped. Maya, little James's mother, approached and nudged her baby aside, but not before making the same gesture herself, trunk to heart, a moment of connection that transcended species. One by one, each elephant in the herd came forward to do the same, creating a ritual that no one present would ever forget. "They're saying goodbye," Sarah realized aloud, her voice breaking. "They understand." The other keepers nodded silently, too moved to speak. They had all heard stories about elephants' emotional intelligence, about their capacity to grieve and remember, but seeing it demonstrated so clearly was overwhelming. James reached for his oxygen mask, and Maria quickly helped him adjust it, but his eyes never left the elephants, and his free hand continued to reach out to touch each trunk that came to bid him farewell. Despite his obvious fatigue, there was a serenity in his expression that touched everyone who witnessed it. As the afternoon wore on, the herd began to demonstrate another remarkable behavior. The elephants started bringing objects to James, items that held special significance in their shared history. Raja carried over a piece of the tire swing that James had installed for him years ago. An elderly female named Luna presented a fragment of the first enrichment toy James had ever given her. Each object seemed to carry a story, a memory that linked these creatures to the man who had devoted his life to them. The growing collection of items at James's feet told a story of decades of care, innovation, and love. Several of the younger keepers were furiously taking notes, recognizing that they were witnessing something unprecedented in the study of elephant behavior. But for James, each object was more than just a scientific observation. It was a piece of his heart being handed back to him. During a quiet moment, while the elephants milled around nearby, James turned to Sarah. "Promise me something," he said, his voice stronger than it had been all day. "Promise me you'll tell their stories. People need to know that elephants aren't just intelligent, they're wise. They understand so much more than we give them credit for." Sarah squeezed his hand, fighting back tears. "I promise," she whispered. "The whole world will know about today. They'll know about you and Rose, and all of them." As if hearing her name, Rose moved closer, her trunk gently caressing James's shoulders in a gesture that looked remarkably like a hug. The sanctuary's resident veterinarian, Dr. Chen, had been observing the day's events with professional interest. "In 30 years of working with elephants," he noted quietly to Maria, "I've never seen anything like this. They're not just demonstrating memory and emotion, they're creating a ceremony. They're paying tribute." As the afternoon began to fade into evening, the elephants showed no sign of leaving James's side. If anything, they seemed to be positioning themselves more deliberately around his wheelchair, forming a protective circle that would soon become the most powerful part of this extraordinary day. The sun's golden light painted the scene in warm hues, and a gentle breeze carried the sweet scent of acacia blossoms across the enclosure. Something was building in the air, a tension, an anticipation. The elephants were not finished yet. They had one final gift to share with their beloved keeper, something that would soon transform this remarkable day into a story that would touch hearts around the world. As twilight approached, the sanctuary staff began preparing for what they assumed would be the end of James's final visit. Maria gently suggested it might be time to head back to the hospice, concerned about his energy levels after such an emotional day. But the elephants had other plans. Rose, who hadn't strayed more than a few feet from James all day, suddenly became agitated when Maria moved to turn the wheelchair. The massive matriarch planted herself firmly in front of them, blocking their path. Her behavior wasn't threatening. If anything, she appeared to be pleading. "Wait," James said softly, reaching up to touch Rose's trunk. "They're not finished yet." Despite his exhaustion, his eyes sparkled with anticipation, as if he somehow understood what was coming. Sarah and Dr. Chen exchanged worried glances, but they had learned long ago to trust James's intuition when it came to these animals. The sun hung low on the horizon now, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. As if orchestrated by some unseen conductor, the herd began to move with purpose. Younger elephants guided their babies toward the center of the enclosure, while the adults formed a larger circle around them. Rose remained by James's side as Maria wheeled him to what seemed to be a designated spot within their formation. What happened next would later be described by witnesses as nothing short of miraculous. The elephants began to sway, their massive bodies moving in perfect synchronization. The movement started slowly, almost imperceptibly, but soon developed into a rhythmic dance. Their trunks weaved through the air in graceful patterns, while their feet struck the ground in a steady tempo. "It's a ritual," Dr. Chen whispered, his scientific detachment forgotten in the face of such an extraordinary display. "They're performing a ritual for him." The doctor had studied elephant behavior for decades, but he had never seen anything like this coordinated display of movement and rhythm. The younger elephants, including little James, moved to the center of the circle. Instead of mimicking the adults' slow, dignified movements, they began to play, tossing dust into the air and trumpeting joyfully. The contrast between the solemnity of the adults and the exuberance of the young ones created a performance that seemed to celebrate both life and legacy. James watched in wonder, tears streaming freely down his face now. "They're showing me everything," he managed to say between ragged breaths. "The whole circle of life at the sanctuary, the healing, the births, the playful moments, the hard times we weathered together. All of it." Sarah, who had been recording the entire display, suddenly noticed something remarkable. The patterns the elephants were making as they moved weren't random. They were recreating shapes and formations that James had used in their training over the years. The circle formations he had pioneered for protective herding, the straight lines they'd learned for medical checkups, the scattered patterns used for enrichment activities. "Look!" she exclaimed, pointing out the shifting formations to the other keepers. "They're showing him his own work. They're performing everything he taught them." The realization sent a ripple of amazement through the growing crowd of observers. As the dance continued, more elephants began to vocalize, creating that haunting chorus they had performed earlier. But this time, the sounds were different, lighter, almost joyful, despite the obvious undertone of farewell. The vibrations seemed to fill the entire sanctuary, creating a physical sensation that everyone present could feel in their bones. Maria, who had been carefully monitoring James's vital signs throughout the day, noticed something extraordinary. Despite the length of time he had been outside and the emotional intensity of the day, his pulse was strong and steady. His breathing, while still labored, had found a rhythm that matched the swaying of the elephants. It was as if their movement and song were somehow lending him strength. The last rays of sunlight caught the dust kicked up by the elephant's dance, creating a golden haze that gave the whole scene an almost otherworldly quality. Visitors who had stayed to witness this remarkable display stood in absolute silence, many filming with their phones, others simply watching with tears in their eyes. Little James broke from the dance formation and approached the wheelchair once more. This time he was carrying something in his trunk, a perfect, unopened lotus flower that had been growing in the sanctuary's pond. With surprising gentleness, the baby elephant placed the flower in James's lap. "Oh, my boy," James whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You really are the clever one, aren't you?" The flower choice wasn't random. James had often compared the sanctuary's work to the lotus, explaining how something beautiful could emerge from the mud of difficult beginnings. As darkness began to settle over the sanctuary, the elephant's dance slowly transformed into something even more extraordinary. The herd began to move in a way that would soon become the most shared and discussed part of this remarkable story. A final gift from these intelligent creatures to the man who had devoted his life to them. The air thrummed with anticipation as the elephants prepared for what would become the most powerful moment of this extraordinary day. A moment that would leave an indelible mark on everyone who witnessed it, and eventually on millions of hearts around the world. In the gathering dusk, the sanctuary's floodlights slowly illuminated the extraordinary scene. The elephants' dance had gradually slowed, but their formation remained, creating a perfect circle around James's wheelchair. Rose stood beside him, her massive presence both protective and gentle, while the rest of the herd continued their synchronized movements with deliberate grace. Then, as if responding to an unheard signal, the elephants began to raise their trunks toward the star-filled sky. One by one, they released a series of trumpeting calls that started soft, but grew in intensity. The sound echoed across the sanctuary, a powerful chorus that seemed to reach toward the heavens themselves. "A salute," James whispered, his voice weak but filled with awe. "They're giving me a salute." The old keeper's hands trembled as he reached out one last time to touch Rose's trunk. The matriarch lowered her head, bringing her eyes level with his, and in that moment, everyone present witnessed something profound. A look of pure understanding passing between two beings who had shared a lifetime of trust and devotion. Suddenly, little James broke from the formation again, but this time the other young elephants followed. They surrounded James's wheelchair, their playful energy transformed into something more purposeful. Together, they began to shower him with petals and soft grass they had gathered earlier, creating a gentle rain of natural confetti. "They're not saying goodbye," Sarah realized, her voice filled with wonder. "They're celebrating him. They're celebrating his life." The revelation spread through the crowd of observers, changing the atmosphere from one of sadness to one of joy and gratitude. The adult elephants moved closer, forming a tight circle around James. Each one reached out with their trunk to touch him one final time. But instead of the solemn goodbye from earlier, these touches were gentle and almost playful, reminiscent of the countless positive interactions they had shared over the years. James's face glowed with happiness as he watched his beloved elephants perform this last tribute. "You see," he said to Maria, his voice stronger than it had been all day, "this is what I've tried to tell people all my life. They're not just animals. They're family. They're teachers. They're keepers of wisdom we're only beginning to understand." As if to prove his point, Rose delicately picked up the lotus flower that little James had brought earlier. With infinite gentleness, she raised it high in her trunk, then carefully separated the petals, letting them fall one by one over James. Each petal seemed to catch the light as it descended, creating a magical display that drew gasps from the onlookers. The other elephants began to sway again, this time in perfect unison, creating soft rumbling sounds that vibrated through the ground. The combination of their movement, the falling petals, and the gentle rumbling created an atmosphere of such pure love and celebration that many of the observers found themselves moved to tears. Dr. Chen, who had been documenting the day's events, finally put down his camera. "In all my years of research," he said quietly, "I never imagined I'd witness anything like this. They're not just demonstrating intelligence or emotion, they're showing us what it means to honor a life well lived." As the evening deepened, James began to show signs of fatigue, but his face reflected a peace and joy that Maria had never seen in any of her patients. "I'm ready now," he said softly, squeezing her hand. "They've given me everything I could have wished for, and more." The elephants seemed to sense that the time had come. They began to back away slowly, maintaining their circular formation, but creating a path for James's wheelchair. As Maria prepared to guide him out, Rose made one final gesture. She reached out with her trunk and touched James's chest, right above his heart, then raised her trunk to her own heart in a mirror image of the gesture. One by one, the other elephants followed suit, creating a farewell ritual that would later be described as one of the most moving displays of animal emotion ever documented. The younger elephants, including little James, added their own touches, playful little trunk bumps and gentle pats that made James smile through his tears. As Maria finally wheeled James toward the sanctuary exit, the elephants began their chorus one last time. But this chorus was different from all the others. It was gentler, almost like a lullaby. The sound followed them all the way to the gate, a soothing melody of love and gratitude. News of the extraordinary day spread quickly. Videos of the elephants' tribute went viral, touching millions of hearts around the world. Scientists studied the footage, amazed by the complexity of behaviors displayed. But for those who had been present, no scientific analysis could fully explain what they had witnessed. 3 days later, James passed peacefully in his sleep, the lotus flower from little James on his bedside table. At the exact moment of his passing, witnesses at the sanctuary reported that the entire elephant herd began to sing, that same gentle chorus they had performed at his farewell. Today, the sanctuary continues James's legacy, sharing his story with visitors from around the world. And every year on the anniversary of his last visit, Rose leads the herd in a special display of movement and sound, a celebration of the man who taught the world that love knows no boundaries and that wisdom can come from the most unexpected sources. The elephants, in their own profound way, had shown that sometimes the deepest goodbyes are not marked by sadness, but by a joyous celebration of a life that touched countless others, both human and animal alike. And in doing so, they had given James and the world an unforgettable gift, a reminder that love, in all its forms, is the greatest legacy we can leave behind.